Thank you for inviting me. I'm really honored. It's my first time in Belgrade, not in the country, but in Belgrade. More than ever, in our postmodern societies, we are in need of myth and of legends to help us cope both individually and collectively with our postmodern realities. So, now, which story can still speak to us? Which myth and which fairy tales are contemporary people likely to relate to, and why? When we speak about mythology, we usually refer to earlier myths, for instance, myth of the antiquity, the Greek or the Egyptian myth, for instance, or we speak about the northern myths, such as the Celtic or the Viking myth. These older myths talk about universal situations, or as Jungians would say, about archetypal situations that men and women have encountered through millenniums. But there are also other stories and other narrative images that are more recent. In particular, during the 17th and 18th century in Western Europe, we see the emergence of new types of stories. Is it okay? Yeah. This Enlightenment period was a turning point in the development of Western cultures. This period marked the onset of modern science and of technology. Yet, the Enlightenment period produced a number of stories having a mythical quality. For instance, you know the myth of Faust, or the flying Hollander, or the golem. And today, we will examine the myth of the vampire. All these stories were heralding various archetypal situations and issues that emerged later in the 20th and 21st century in the postmodern cultures. You see, you have 16th, 17th century are really talking about 20th, 21st century's issues. That's in all of these myths. In that sense, we can say that the Enlightenment period carried the seeds of various postmodern quandaries. Now, I have shrunk a 3-slot presentation in one, and I'm hoping to convey the essence of it. I would like to demonstrate the complex and multifaceted aspects of this particular myth and how it symbolizes 3 central topics of postmodern psychopathology. That is, the narcissism, borderline, and psychopathy. But before I go to the psychopathy and the psychopathology, let's explore briefly the myth itself. Well, the vampire does not come from the Balkans. It has its origin there, some of it, but it was really created in the salons in London, Paris, and Rome. Okay. When I claim that the myth of the vampire is a modern myth, some of you might be surprised. Many people have the feeling that this character has always been existing in the collective imagery, but no, not as such. Of course, we find certain elements of this iconography of the vampire in older periods, because myths are always built from various fragments or various elements that are borrowed from different cultures. So let's look at these various fragments. Oh, here. The vampire is a creature who is striving to live forever. Of course, the motif of eternal life has been an existential question since the dawn of humanity. It's the corollary of self-consciousness which characterizes human species. The oldest text ever written is Sumerian. It is a story of a hero, Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh is seeking immortality. So perhaps he's the first vampire. The modern vampire is primarily a predator, and his predation is marked by licentious sexuality. And we find this double theme of licentious predation very early in the antiquity with the myth of Lilith, also in Mesopotamia, but later than Gilgamesh. And Lilith of Mesopotamia is a spirit of the air which comes to visit men at night. She's mating with them while they are sleeping and being unconscious. Which is still a great fear and even a form of neurosis in particular part of the world, like in India. I did my doctoral thesis in India and in Nepal, and at the time, men were still afraid of the succumbers. And in psychiatry, you could see that type of neurosis. We find another mythical predator figure considered as lustful and prurient with the Hebraic Lilith. It's not the same Lilith as the other one. And Lilith becomes a nocturnal spirit after she is casted out of paradise. She becomes a greedy ogress who kills her children and drink their blood. Sorry. But I don't go into this Lily, but she was there before Eve. She was the first woman of Adam before Eve. But she has the same characteristic as the vampire. Modern myth also incorporate ancient motifs. For instance, around the 10th century, in the region that are today Greece, Albania, and Romania, we find the vrikolacas. I don't know if you had them up here. I don't think it was as high as what is today Serbia. And so the vrikolacas are somnambular creatures that come only when it's full moon. So you have also a motif of the vampire. They are craving blood, and they roam the countryside in search of victims, preferably humans. In the same area, in the south of the Balkans, 200 years later, in the 12th century, the same term, vrikolacas, now designates the corpses which have not been decaying after death. They are buried and they stay whole. When a dead body remained intact, this was a proof of the soul's damnation, usually after excommunication. You know, that was a time when the Orthodox priests, were trying to gain their market share over the Roman priests. So they excommunicated some people, and if they found the corpse whole, entire, they would call them bricolacas. And so they were opening coffins to verify that the corpses were in the proper state of decay. Of course, in these dry areas like in Greece, sometimes they were not. I mean, they were still dry or not so decayed, in which case there was a ceremony and the priest would peg a stake around the solar plexus of the corpse. So you have also some motif that you will find in a vampire. In modern myth, they also built on phenomena that are observed in nature. The construction of the myth of the vampire was also inspired by a medical condition well described in the Renaissance. Today, we know that it is a genetic blood disease named porphyria. The main symptoms is hypersensitivity to light, and these people could only go out at night after sunset. Also, there were no transfusions at the time, blood transfusion, and it was recommended that these people ingest lots of pig blood to help their condition. In addition, porphyric people are likely to develop unusual pilosity. Body hair can be so dense that these people can look monstrous, like a wolf. And porphyric people have most severe problems with their gums, as these medical photos illustrate. You know, their gums are retrieving. So you can see that this natural phenomenon of porphyria, which was not so rare in the Renaissance, is fueling the imagination of people. Okay, then besides the natural phenomenon, modern myths are also inspired by historical anecdotes. For instance, the first historical figure who comes as an inspiration to the myth is Vlad Tepes, or Vlad Dracul, an aristocrat from the region of Transylvania. You probably know him. He was a hero in that sense that he chased the Ottomans, but he was known to be ruthless and incredibly cruel to his enemies, or at least this is what the travelers brought back to London, Paris, Rome, etc. In particular, he plundered villages ruled by his enemies, and then he had their population impaled on stakes. His nickname was Vlad the Impaler. And he drank the blood of his enemies, and anecdotes of his cruelty spread all over Europe. Another historical figure that you might know, who was a source of inspiration, was a Hungarian countess named Elizabeth Báthory, who also lived in the 16th century. She was said to be extremely beautiful and also extremely sadistic. The legend says that she remained beautiful for several decades, well into old age and before plastic surgery. Her secret was that her regular bathing in the blood of young virgins gave her that, conserved that beauty. And she also drank their fresh blood as well, so the blood of young virgins. But it is only in the 18th century that for the first time the use of the term vampire appears in Germany, then in Italy, in England, and in France. It is used first in the context of naturalist interest found in some intellectual circles. Travelers returning from the Balkan and from Central Europe were reporting incredible description and fabulous stories around certain creatures called vampires. And of course, to be interesting in their environment, these travelers invented stories. So that's the beginning of the 18th century. And then towards the end of the 18th century, the vampire becomes a philosophical question and a most fashionable topic in all the European salons. It's really an incredible phenomenon if you think, because the 18th century was the century of rationality, science, technology. I mean, it was, and then it's really what Jung talks about in enantiomia. You have the other side of being totally rational. Okay, but then we have, I would say, the vampire as we know it today really appears in the 19th century. The myth takes a new turn because it becomes an inspiring character for the Romantic writers. 19th century is the time of Romantic writers. So you have in England Lord Byron and Polidori. In Russia, Tolstoy talks about, and Gogol talk about vampire. In France, you have Jules Verne, Théophile Gautier. In Italy, you have etc., etc. And then, I miss a slide. Oh, okay. And then it's finally the novel Dracula, which brings the vampire as we know it now. The novel was written by Bram Stoker, and in a more academic form, if you want. Bram Stoker was an Irish author, and he wrote Dracula after an extensive research in Central Europe and in Eastern Europe folklore and mythological studies. So when Bram Stoker wrote, he knew all the elements I gave you before. And it still remains the reference today, even if the myth has continued to evolve. So you see, it's a myth which is alive because it evolves. And it evolves particularly with the film industry. It is actually the topic which has produced the larger number of films. I was able to identify over 300 films, and this is not exhaustive. Of course, lots of them are very bad, but it's interesting. All these movies have resulted in widening the mythical dimension of the character. In the past 20 years, it is the TV series that have had the greatest impact on the young generations. The theme of the vampire has been widely developed in novellas, TV series, video games created for teenage audiences. I don't know if it's the same here, but in France, in the past 15, 20 years, teenagers young teenagers, like 10, 12-year-old, are just totally enamored with vampire stories. Teenagers identify readily with the indestructibility and with the power and with the independence of the vampire. Another proof that this myth is very alive today is the use of the vampire in advertising, because it is a symbol and not a mere sign. We can talk about it later. The complexity of the references makes it very attractive for the advertising agent, because it's really polysemantic. And for us, psychotherapists, psychoanalysts, psychologists, how can we read this myth? We could approach it in many ways, but I thought it would be interesting to approach it as the myth talking about the narcissistic condition. I'm not just going to talk about narcissism, the pathology as described in the DSM or the ICD, but really the narcissistic condition, which probably it applies to everyone. Also, as talking about the borderline condition and dynamics, and finally, about talking about psychopathic states and dynamics, which are all three very modern questions in psychopathology. You don't find these before the mid-20th century. So I will go to my part 2. I have not checked the time. Let me put my timer. Okay. So I will use the term here of narcissism in a wider psychoanalytic sense, not in a narrow way of the personality disorder that is given in the nosology of the DSM or the ICD. The first characteristic of the vampire is his voracity. He is hungry and a greedy creature with insatiable appetite. His voracity can take three different aspects: oral greed, with imperious need to feed on fresh blood; sexual voracity, to seduce and possess his prey; and yearning voracity for power and domination. Greediness is the first curse of the vampire and of the narcissist, because they can never have enough. They can never be satisfied and fulfilled. The more blood the vampire drinks, the more he needs. Yearning for more is what defines and activates the vampire and the narcissist. This same yearning is also what defines the zeitgeist of postmodern consumerism. The term narcissism was cornered by an alienist around the same time Bram Stoker was writing Dracula. It was designating a form of perversion in which the subject treats his own body as a sexual object. The alienist Paul Necker was born in St. Petersburg, and he wrote at the time, "The patient who suffers of narcissism contemplates his body with an unusual interest. Ultimately, there is a similarity between such self-investment and sexual pleasure. So you see, the original definition of narcissism looks surprisingly close to the relationship that some of our patients might entertain with their body nowadays. This earlier definition of narcissism also fits our zeitgeist when the advertising industry is treating bodies as sex objects with a total fluidity. This is a recent commercial for makeup, surfing on age and gender fluidity and on an ambiguity between orality and sexuality. And this is a good example of what I want to say. Indeed, the character of the vampire is always caught in a similar ambiguity between orality and sexuality. The deadly kiss of the vampire is assimilated to coitus. Anne Rice is the American author of a very popular series, Vampire Chronicles. Her main protagonist, the vampire Lestat, remembers one of his first feeds in the most erotic way. I don't know if I have the time to read it, but okay, I can read it. I embraced the young lady who was offering herself to me. All in a sudden, her body stiffened just as my fangs were tearing the walls of her arteries. We both tightened up in a state of great tension. I let my fangs slowly, although inexorably, penetrate her artery. It was like sliding into her. Then I felt a surge of warm and thick blood on my lips, and my entire being was overwhelmed in a voluptuous state. It was so extraordinarily delicious that I forgot to pull out and withdraw before her heart stopped beating. As you see, it's totally eroticized. Well, you won't be surprised if I tell you that before the immense success of the vampire saga, this author was writing pornographic novels. The vocabulary and the description are the same in both literature. Actually, in most vampire literature, the descriptions are utterly boring, as in a state of perpetual onanism. And that's also very narcissistic. And in around 1909, Sigmund Freud redefines the term narcissism. And we were at the definition of Paul Necker, and then we come to 1909 Freud. So for Freud, it is no longer a form of perversion, but a necessary stage of development. And some people remain fixated in that stage. The vampire symbolizes this arrest of development in the oral stage. His sexuality remains stuck in orality. Likewise, some patients try to gulp down any experience which will bring them a moment of paradisic hallucination. We Jungian would say that they are stuck in an endless Ouroboros, hoping to stay forever in the Great Mother. In our work with adolescent and young patients, young adults, we witness many such situations of attempt to regress back to a lost paradise. And we will speak about it tomorrow and Sunday. Accepting renouncement and sacrifice, to use Jung's terms, or accepting the frustration and the disappointment that comes with the principle of reality is increasingly intolerable for many patients. In this sense, the narcissist, like the vampire, remains in a state of perpetual pathos, feeling forever sorry for himself or herself. There's a great romanticism in that. The capacity to gradually understand frustration starts at an early age, but children are often shut up with an oral pacifier as soon as they try to express their discontent. A few years ago in France, vampire teething nookies, such as this one, were the most fashionable. It's humor, of course, but it's also very symbolic. What is supposed to pacify the baby also portrays him as a predator. You know, he's pacified, but he's a predator. And so what are we projecting on our children? After Freud, a number of psychoanalysts have tried to expand the theory of narcissistic experience. For Heinz Kohut and Otto Kernberg, narcissism is the result of a severe disturbance in the way the person perceives herself. As you know, the mirror does not cast the reflection of the vampire. When a vampire looks at himself in the mirror, he sees nothing. It's the same for the narcissist. We are talking about, in English, of self-regard, which literally is the sight or the gaze that a person has of herself. And the narcissist's self-regard is broken or empty. This is what Otto Kernberg is saying about these patients whose self-regard is so disturbed. I quote him. In their relation to others, these patients are constantly referring to themselves. They have a great need to be loved and admired by others. They display a curious contradiction between an enlarged consideration of themselves and an out-of-the-ordinary need to be praised. The own inner mirror of these patients reflects nothing. Thus, their self-regard needs to be mediated by the specular regard of others, such as in the selfies. Dracula is wondering in the novel, am I the one who is the most feared of all? For this TV series Vampires, the eternal question is, am I the sexiest of all, the most irresistible of all? But because the vampire cannot consider others as subjects, he is indeed alone in the world. Thus, the competition he is launching is first and foremost a competition with himself. Likewise, it is very difficult for many of our patients to accept to just be ordinary, just to live an ordinary life. The idea of being just like everyone else is terrifying to them. They need to be special. This explains, I think, why the myth is so alive today. These special beings with supernatural powers who can escape the banality of the real life are perfect objects of identifications. Another feature which is characterizing the vampire is indifference to others' pain. and even indifference to his fellows vampires' suffering. Relations between vampires are almost always about rivalry, jealousy, envy, or calculated alliances in the novels or stories. Very rarely do the vampire stories talk about fraternity and friendship. To continue, Otto Kernberg. For those who are studying psychology, I think Otto Kernberg is the greatest author. It's already old. He wrote in the 70s, 80s. But for me, it's still the best reference to understand the borderline condition and the narcissistic condition from a psychoanalytic point of view. So I close my parenthesis. He writes, these patients, the narcissists, envy others on the mode of idealizations or scorn. Either they idealize a person from whom they are expecting narcissistic benefits, or they depreciate and treat with contempt those whom they expect nothing. In general, their relationship reveal obvious aspects of exploitation. Okay, so end of the quote. And this feature of the vampire, I think, also reflects the zeitgeist of our times. In many professional and political circles, life is considered as a perpetual competition where the end justifies the means, and more often. Quite naturally, in the end, this narcissist Weltanschauung, this narcissistic view of the world, locks the subject up in his own prison, is self-imprisoned. Just like the vampire can never be at peace because he's imprisoned in his own logic of predation, in his own folly of might and eternity, the narcissist remains the puppet of his drives and of his impulses. They are both addicere to the same autonomous complexes and patterns of repetition. Jung talks about autonomous complexes. Actually, the term addicere gave the term addiction. And addicere means under the influence of or controlled by. So the vampire, the narcissists are addicere to their own mechanisms. So the question is how to stop this endless repetition, as in any addiction. How to stop this continual reiteration of the same scenario. For that, the vampire literature gives a number of apotropaic solutions. In Greek, the term apotropein means to divert, to change the natural course of something. So the first apotropaic measure is to peg a stake in the heart of the vampires while they are sleeping, that is, during the day. This stops his heart to continue to function in a corrupted and rogue way. It's a most violent act, but it's also a deed of courage, performed by a hero who has not been made a vampire yet. In the case of the narcissist, this apotropaic recipe symbolizes the need to stop the old ways of relating to oneself and to others, which is a form of sacrifice. This sacrifice is totally, utterly contra naturam, to use Jung's term, against nature for the narcissist. And it rarely happens, actually. But if this happens, the individual also gains a new capacity to experience the self. Okay, so I sort of circumambulated around the question of narcissism in connection to the vampire, or in mirror to the vampire. And again, for those who are not necessarily clinician, I'm not just talking about pathology of a person. I'm also talking about pathology of a collective. When I talk about the zeitgeist, it's really, I think, the pathology of our time. The myth of the vampire is a powerful illustration of the psychic dynamic of blurring boundaries and transgressing limits. In this sense, this myth is perfectly suited to illustrate the borderline experience. I'm talking about the borderline experience, not the borderline pathology. The Norwegian artist Edvard Munch painted a portrait of his mad sister as a vampire. But who is the vampire? Is it the beautiful young girl with her hair on fire? Or is it the dark, faceless man? Which of these two protagonists is the predator and the predatee? Impossible to determine. So entangled are their bodies. And sometimes when we work with borderlines, this is exactly what we experience. The evolution of the vampire iconography is very interesting in that it highlights the confusion that this character is creating in us. The first vampires of the silent movies were supposed to give you the creeps, with no possible identification with them, like the one on the left, the Murnau movies from the 1930s. Then there is the uncanny strangeness of the romantic vampires, which is meant to arouse fascination and to create resonance in us. Like the middle one, Belugo. Today, the vampires of the TV series, with their piercing and gothic looks, are meant to be objects of identification for teenage audiences. Similarly, borderline patients often experience a delinquence of cognitive, moral, and ethical references. A destructuring of their integrity, a breakdown of their own image. Actually, destructuration is a key feature for borderline, especially in its physical integrity. The vampire has the ability to decorporalize, to become transparent, or to take another appearance. Dracula of Bram Stoker can transform himself into a wolf or into mist, and as such can enter anywhere. In the borderline experience, there is a confusion between the inside and the outside of the body. The skin envelope is not experienced as a container. Let's just see. Where does my body end and the other begins? The lower parts of the vampire and of her prey seems to be merging in a two-headed monster here, like in the Munch painting. This image also evokes a total state of confusion between rape and consented rapture. In the borderline state, the individual is unable to recognize his own subjectivity. He can only see things in his own light, a light which remains very dim. His psychic experience seems to be trapped in a spider's web. Those who are bitten by a vampire are infected, and as a result of this infection, are likely to become themselves vampires. In the same way, therapists who come in contact with borderline dynamics are always at risk of being infected. We call that countertransference. Actually, to describe this type of countertransference, Jung used the term psychic infection. I'm sure we can think of examples of psychic infection in our own practice or in the case we supervise. The entry door for the psychic infection is always the analyst's point of vulnerability and weakness. I have an example, but I think I will skip it at this point. Melanie Klein named such phenomenon projective identification. When a person simply projects onto someone, she can remain more or less conscious of the fact that she's projecting, and once she's finished projecting, she feels relieved, and she can stop and move on to something else. That's normal projection. But with projective identification, the person who is projecting splits part of herself, remains totally aware of the process. She needs to stay with what has been projected onto the other person, and she's unable to move on to something else. She's stuck with this phenomenon of projection. And it's exactly what happens with the vampire. On the collective level, we also observe projective identification mechanisms that function autonomously. They spread like an infection. Such collective dynamics of projective identification may result in what the philosopher Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. I don't know how it is here, but we have a lot of moral harassment around teenagers who end up in suicide. That's exactly the same. The banality of evil would therefore be the impossibility of becoming aware of the splitting phenomenon that is happening in oneself or in the society. In the case of simple projection, the splitting is said to be horizontal. The material that is being pushed in the unconscious or the subconscious. So there is a chance that it can become conscious again, or at least partially conscious. But in the case of projective identification, the splitting is vertical, meaning that the reflexive ego is unable to access the other part of the psyche. It's a form of a severe dissociation. The borderline, never-ending experience of vertical splitting is symbolized by the perverted rhythm of the vampire life. During the day, he remains catatonic in his coffin, As long as there is sunlight, he is unable to join the human community, and his psychic life remains sunk in unconscious lethargy. So you see, he's not alive, actually. The vampire, like the borderline, is incapable of solar consciousness, only of colorless nocturnal impressions and undifferentiated contours. And if the analyst or the therapist throws too much light on these patients, for instance, by providing too much interpretation or too early interpretation, or by confronting them too soon, then the splitting mechanism is set again in motion. So if you interpret too quickly, it will continue. In his massively split experience, the vampire always remains between and betwixt. He is neither dead or alive. This double neither nor is precisely what characterizes the borderline experience. Because of constant splitting, the borderline psyche becomes thinner and thinner with time, and the psychic experience becomes poorer and poorer to the point of reaching total psychic paucity. If you have patients who are old borderlines, you can see that as they have split and split and split so much that there is just nothing left. In the borderline experience, the person cannot conceive life as an opportunity for growth. The borderline experience consists of one crisis after the other, without ever reaching a new stage of consciousness. We can compare this crisis as a sort of psychic hiccup. The phenomenon was described in the 1930s by an American psychoanalyst, Helen Deutsch, who coined the term stable instability. And that's exactly the vampire. He is stable in his instability. It continues forever. Helen Deutsch also observed that these patients give the impression that their relationships are unreal, even if at first sight they might seem like functioning in a relatively normal way. And in 1934, Helen Deutsch coined another term, personality as if, which can be, it's what Winnicott will call later false self. Just as the vampire has no reflection in the mirror, behind the facade of the as-if personality, there is nothing but emptiness. So back to the question of apotropaic recipes in the vampire myth. The second strategy for protecting yourself from a vampire is to threaten him with a cross. When confronted with a cross, the vampire recoils. Jung explains that the cross, the symbol of the cross, represents the ability to hold the tension of the opposites. Jung also explains that a new consciousness can only arise if we manage to remain in the experience of psychic quartering or crucifixion that is produced by the tension of the opposites. But like the vampire, the borderline is unable to hold opposites together. This is because, as we've seen, the dynamics of splitting and acting out are immediately set in motions. Now, I'd like to go to my last part, which is vampires and the psychopathic phenomenon. Again, perhaps more than pathology, I should talk about phenomenon or experience. Cruelty has always existed, but with the Enlightenment, 18th century, it becomes an aesthetic phenomenon and a subject of curiosity. So that's new, you see. The phenomenon of psychopathy is highly complex. There is always a noticeable lowering or even an absence of moral awareness. Here, I'm going to consider psychopathy on the broad spectrum of increasing dehumanization. So I'm going to talk about a continuum. On the more humanized side, we find narcissistic perversion. I recommend you to view a very interesting documentary on YouTube. A journalist talks to Shmuel Vatkin, a professor of psychology who claims to be a psychopath. This 90-minute film gives a very good understanding of the structure and the dynamics of the narcissistic pervert. Perverts can be charming and engaging, like Dracula with Mina. But in reality, they deceive their prey in order to exploit the situation. Paul Racamier, a French Lacanian psychoanalyst, writes, "Narcissistic perversion is a durable psychic organization characterized by the ability to cut oneself off from internal conflicts and in particular from grief. The subject achieves this by asserting himself at the expense of an object that is manipulated like a utensil. Once perverts have gained the other's trust, they destabilize their victim. First, they seduce them, they get their trust, and they destabilize them. They blow hot and cold to produce maximum stress on their victims. And Vatkin on his interview explains that very well. It's fascinating. Narcissistic perversion is the foundation of the successful psychopath that can be found in business and politics today. They are perfectly adapted to neoliberal environments in the sense that their lack of moral accountability gives them a decisive advantage over others. As the result, they end up with the best job, they marry the most beautiful women, they are very successful. Like this one, for instance. These successful narcissists have a tendency of megalomania and paranoia, a propensity for comedy and avoidance, high impulsivity, and they are excellent liars. And you see where the world goes today. But they are enraged when caught in a lie. However, they have a spot of weakness because they always go further. It is their excesses that brings their fall, usually. In this way, many effective psychopaths carry in themselves their own destruction. So, moving on the spectrum, we find antisocial psychopathy. Here it is the transgression itself which brings great pleasure. Dracula is not content just to drink blood of any victim. He could have stayed in his castle for that. He needs innocent virgins. He needs to steal the fiancée of Jonathan. His true pleasure is to destroy what is beautiful, what is good, what is pure. Antisocial psychopaths are extremely impulsive and often the perpetrators of domestic violence. I don't know if this is the case here, but in France now and in Germany, there is a big movement against feminicide. Okay. And these are among they fall in this category. Today, there is a real awareness of the need to protect the partners, wives, and daughters of such men. Continuing along our spectrum, we arrive at the malignant self. We have here extreme malevolence. Here it is the element of cruelty that characterizes psychopathy. Performing act of sadism is a source of great satisfaction. It was Erich Fromm who the first used this term in the 60s to describe the pathology of the quintessence of evil. Yet in the evil self, there is still a form of emotion. It is a sadistic emotion and a perverse jubilation, but nonetheless, the sadist feels some form of bond with his victim. So for those who work with this, with these types of patients, there is still some hope. But further along the continuum, there are psychopaths with no feelings, no affect, no connection whatsoever. The Nosferatu of the silent movies represent this very advanced stage of dehumanization. It just inspires nameless terror. Serial killers fall in this category. But it's interesting to see how many novels are staging serial killers. So there is a fascination today in our society for that. Serial killers operate in total secrecy with no apparent motive. They feel no particular pleasure and remain fairly indifferent to the terror they inflict on their victims. Each aggression simply allows a discharge of something inside them that remains unrepresentable. So it's totally ununderstandable for us. Neuroscientists have discovered that in the brains of these psychopaths, the zone corresponding for fear anticipation remains largely inactive. So, and the activation of this area in the brain is fundamental to feel empathy. So they cannot feel empathy. This would probably explain why serial killers have absolutely no superego, no morality. We are now reaching to the end of our continuum with the werewolf type of vampires. In many novels, the werewolf and the vampire are staged together. And in the previous slides, Nosferatu had still proto-human features. But here, the werewolf type of vampire is no more than a beast. On the night of full moons, he grows hair, he goes to a four-legged posture and loses his ability to speak. He cannot speak anymore. During these episodes of metamorphosis, he needs to eat human flesh. And this ultimate stage is symbolic of what is happening in genocide. Of course, the werewolf is another myth, a myth linked to the vampire, but perhaps I think it's a symbol of the what's happening in the genocides. Just like the werewolf undergoes a temporary metamorphosis into a beast, there are temporary collective dissociation which makes a genocidal parenthesis possible. All of a sudden, the perpetrators find themselves cut off from any association between their own values, their own history, and their victims, who are often neighbors or even former comrades. The testimony of Hutus who cut up dozens of their Tutsi neighbors show that they had no hatred for them, just a radical indifference toward them. This temporary indifference makes that robotization of mass murder possible. Oh, as you are now experiencing it, we are now trading unthinkable territories. But what does concern me is the current inflation in the iconography of monsters and horror figures in films and video games. Even more numerous, even more monstrous, even more cretinous, these creatures are ever more popular. I suppose here too. So, what kind of apothropaic recipe can be applied to psychopathy? The myths tell us that the vampire's head must be cut off and placed far away from the rest of the body so that it cannot join itself. As explained earlier, neurosciences have shown that in the psychopath, the circuit of fear and empathy tend to dysfunction. It's as if they are without a body and everything is happening in their head. Thus, symbolically, the head has to be kept separate from the body. And some think this is not enough. Sometimes it is still not enough. In this case, the last resort is to burn the vampire while he sleeps by exposing him to the fire of the sun. I'm sorry, it's here. Ah, no. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. In this case, the last resort is to burn the vampire while he sleeps by exposing him to the fire of the sun. The sun rays will reduce him to ashes, eliminating all trace of incarnation. So, to stop all incarnation. Okay, now we have some time for discussion. So, I know that I represent that what I'm presenting is a little dry. It's more trying to link images and symbols without clinical observation. So, but again, for those who are not necessarily therapists or seeing patients, you can think about that on a collective level.